Back to Unit 3, Day 11. Today we're going to talk about Russia. Reminders to have at your history notebook and you're taking notes as you move through the video. And make sure you complete the vocabulary for this video by either highlighting it in your notes or writing down the definitions. Key terms for today: Intelligentsia, Decembrist Uprising, Nicholas I, Alexander II, Pan-Slavism, Russo-Japanese War, Crimean War, Emancipation of Serfs, Count Witte, Marxism, Revolution of 1905, and the Duma. Key concepts today are Russian weakness and reforms in the 19th century, Russian discontent, and radicalism. So we'll start with mapping out Russia. Remember, Russia's kind of manifest destiny was the spread east to the Pacific Ocean, and we're going to talk about why that becomes kind of an issue and where it goes from there. So let's talk about Russia before the big reforms. Russian leaders in the 18th and early 19th centuries try to isolate Russia from European revolutions. Napoleon's invasion is going to complete the shift to conservatism and really stop Russia from trying to reform. Russian intellectuals, or the intelligentsia, will remain connected to Western European trends and try to kind of reform Russia from within. 1825 and after, we have the Decembrist Uprising. This is when the Western-oriented military officials that attempt a coup against the government, the kind of conservative government, and it's going to be defeated by the imperial forces, and all its members will be hung. Tsar Nicholas I will turn to repressive conservatism. During this time, Russia lacked a substantial middle or artisan classes, and both of these things helped Russia to avoid the mid-1800s, the mid-19th century revolutions. All right, so let's talk about some economic and social problems. The reality of Russia's position is that the economy remained primarily agrarian, meaning that they mostly farmed. Even after some attempts for industrialization by Catherine and Peter the Great, that doesn't really catch on. And they really begin to fall behind the West in terms of production and trade. This is kind of culminates with the Crimean War in 1854 to 1856, which really demonstrated how far Russia had fallen behind the West. Russia will attempt to invade the Crimean Peninsula. British and French forces are going to swiftly defeat the Russian forces from Crimea. And this really convinced that Tsar Alexander II that reform was really, really needed. Because when I say they got defeated swiftly, it was like, oh, it's over. Right? Again, they attempt to take over the Crimean Peninsula, and they're defeated. Right? It was pretty bad and pretty quick. Right? Now, we have a peasant problem. Right? There is a belief that freer labor force could increase profitability. Right? And a series of minor peasant rebellions in the 1850s stimulated this movement for reform. Well, Tsar Alexander II emancipates the serfs in 1861. And freed serfs got most of the land, while the aristocracy or the higher class retained that political and economic power. The issue is that most of these serfs remain tied to the villages they were already in. But the emancipation did produce a larger urban labor force, as many of these serfs can now move to cities. They can now move away from the villages. And this led to regional peasant uprisings and peasant distrust. And people really began to it really began to kind of cause this more powder keg scenario of them not being trustful and not being, happy. All right, so Alexander II, he carries out other reforms. He's going to issue new law codes, establish regional councils, zemstvos, for input on local decisions. He's going to begin military reforms. He's going to spread literacy, and becomes extremely common with the rise of mass markets and popular literary forms. Nonfiction and fiction books, right? The reading plague sweeps over Russia. Women gain power slightly through access to greater education. Uh, Between the 1880s and 1910s, they're going to rapidly industrialize. Modern factories begin to develop in major Russian cities. Count Sergei Witte, the Minister of Finance from 1892 to 1903, will enact high tariffs to protect these new Russian industries. Witte will also encourage Western investment in Russian industrialization. Um, this is a double-edged sword. As a result, nearly one half of Russia's industrial businesses are foreign owned. Right? The masses of the Russian citizens are only slightly affected by Russianization due to this foreign-owned businesses, meaning that most of the money is going out of Russia. Military reforms did not substantially alter the concept of peasant conscripts serving aristocratic landlords, but it did produce a substantial middle class, this kind of working class, this kind of, not rich, not super poor. But again, these results of the industrialization is that Western does become more modernized and become more westernized. Right? Now, Russia's foreign policies is mainly to undo the impact of the Crimean War. And they want to conquer the Ottoman Empire. I mean, it's right there. They're the sick man of Europe. They're dying. Might as well. Russia also wants to expand its Asian influence and expand the Russian influence among the Balkan people. Now, most of the people of the Balkan consider themselves to be Slavic, which is a major ethnic group in the Balkans. Right? So the idea of Pan-Slavism comes up, which many Russians are already Slavs. So the idea was to portray Russia as the leader of all the Slavic people. Right? Combo this with an alliance of France in 1894 and later with England. Right? Russia is really kind of starting to rise up. Now, 1904 comes around. This is the end of Russian military expansion because Japan and Russia come into conflict over expansion in northern China. The Japanese wiped the floor with Russia, right? And forced Russia to sign a humiliating treaty. It's a mess. Russians consider themselves to be Europeans and superior to Asians. So when Russia gets curb stomped by Japan, it's a fiasco. This unleashes all of the dissenting opinions and all of the dissenting forces in Russia and really begins the long road to revolution. Now, during the 1880s, Russia becomes more politically unstable. Ethnic minorities begin to kind of push for national recognition. Recurrent famines, right? If you can't eat, you get angry. Who do you blame? You blame the government. This leads to peasants' unrest. Intellectual protests to push for more westernization begin. Business and professional people sought further liberal reforms to help them kind of gain money and gain power in their businesses, right? The radical intelligentsia demand revolution. Intellectual radicalism shaded off into terrorism and anarchy as a way to restructure society. And due to all this, Alexander II was assassinated in 1881, which was an issue because Alexander II was supportive of reforms and was reforming the government actively, but they assassinate him. And his successor, his son, clamps down and imposes more repressive politics to stop the unrest. In the 1890s, the intellectuals picked up Marxism, which is just communism, from the West as a means of organizing the revolution. Vladimir Lenin introduced innovations in Marxism to accommodate the reality of Russian society. And radicalism begins to spread rapidly amongst the urban workers who form unions and engage in strikes, which really irritates the government, which forces them to clamp down even harder, which forces them to become more dictatorial, more repressive, to stop these reforms from stopping the country. right? Now, the Russian Revolution of 1905 began when soldiers mistakenly opened fire on a pro-Tsarist demonstration, right? Very similar to uh, the Boston Massacre, the start of the American Revolution. This is really going to start the Russian Revolution of 1905, right? Soldiers and sailors are going to mutiny at the end of the Russo-Japanese War. Urban workers produce widespread strikes. Peasant revolts erupt all over Russia, right? And after repression failed, the Tsar's government offered reforms. He's like, hey, wait a minute, calm down. I'm going to create the Duma, or the National Parliament, and he also is going to allow a multi-party system, and he's going to have a constitution written. Minister Stolfen is going to enact these reforms, which is going to says it's going to have a lighter burdens on the peasantry, offers a peasant place in village councils. Some peasants begin to accumulate land. Well, it sounds great that the revolution stops, life is good. And Tsar Nicholas II, basically after everything calmed down, immediately took back all of the things he said, and a new round of strikes followed, and Russia will remain extremely politically unstable until the Russian Revolution of 1918. So, that's all I have for you today, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, and I'll see you guys in class.